Landlords can really suck sometimes, from charging way too much rent to waiting way too long to fix the problems in houses that they manage. But no matter how good a landlord is, there is a more structural reason why they're bad, one that not even the best landlord can escape. And that reason is the class divide. If you're watching this video, then that means the chances are high that you belong to the 99% that are classified as workers. Or as Karl Marx called it, the proletariat. That means that the way you make your money to buy the things you need and to live is by trading your work and your effort, your time, for an hourly wage. Now, that part, in and of itself, is fair enough. In a vacuum, if I give you $20 to mow my lawn, there's nothing wrong with that if we're both happy with it. But that doesn't mean that we have achieved ethical capitalism just yet, because that word, in a vacuum, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. You see, in capitalism, we don't deal with just workers and fair and consensual exchange of money and services. We also have to deal with another class, the 1%, the owning class, or the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is characterized as not working for an hourly wage, but instead making their money through owning things. Let's say that in that example of me paying you to mow my lawn, I hire you to mow lawns in the entire street. You go around and mow 5 of my neighbors' lawns for $20 each, but when you come back, I take half of that. When you're rightfully outraged and ask why I could take that money, I say, well, yeah, it is true, I didn't do any work for it, but I own the lawnmower. That's a fairly oversimplified example of the relationship between the owning class and the working class. The owning class doesn't really have a choice in that engagement. I mean, they can choose who they work for, but they can't choose to work. You need to have money. You need to pay the bills. You need to pay rent, electricity. You need to eat. And for that, you need money. And in order to get money, well, unless you want to go trading Bitcoin, odds are you're going to have to work for someone who owns a company. And you can't buy means of production yourself. That lawnmower is way too expensive for you to afford. You can't buy a factory. You are reliant on the bourgeoisie to do any work and to get money that you need to live. And that puts the owning class in a position of power. Because they own the means of production, which in this case is the lawnmower, but could also be a factory, they can take whatever cut they want. Sure, you can go to a different company, but it operates the same way. They call the shots. They decide how much money you get, and you can be happy with that cut or see if you can get more somewhere else. Now, what am I going on about? What is this to do with landlords? What am I talking about the means of production for? Well, the point is that landlords are also part of the bourgeoisie. They are also part of the owning class, and they are bad for a lot of similar reasons. The first of which is that the relationship is largely involuntary. You don't really have a choice whether you live in a house or not. I mean, going off living in the woods in a cabin you built yourself is as much a good alternative to buying a house as is rummaging through a garbage bin for food is an alternative to buying groceries. The truth is that if you want to function in modern day society in any meaningful way, then you're really not going to get away with living in a tent. You need a house. But how do you get a house? Well, you can buy it or you can rent it. Buying requires a large amount of capital, which a lot of people don't really have at the moment. So renting is, for a lot of people, the only option. And when you rent, the only option you have is to fund a landlord. Now again, just like with where you work, you have the option to choose who your landlord is. It's not really transparent. I mean, a landlord commonly does run a background check on you, but when was the last time you ran a background check on a landlord? When was the last time you ran a credit score check on your landlord? You don't rent for the landlord, you rent for the property, and you just have to hope and pray that the landlord that's attached to it is any good. Even if you do have the ability to buy, well, you're still funding the same types of people. real estate investors who make a profit off of not really adding much to society, but just selling a house that they bought for a profit. And that profit is also part of the problem. You see, owning isn't work. The reason why you get paid when you go to work is because your work is valuable. The difference in price between raw materials and a final product is the labor that someone put into that product. Without work, a dress is just a piece of cloth and is not worth nearly as much. That is why you get paid, because your labor is valuable. You add value to the world and to the product. But owning doesn't make things more valuable. A house that has been bought by an investor and added 15% to and resold isn't really worth more. It's more expensive, but the value didn't increase. It's more expensive, but the value of the materials didn't change. Likewise with an apartment. An apartment does become more valuable if you rent it from a landlord or if you rent it directly from the government. Landlords, and more broadly the owning class, are fundamentally different from the working class because they don't really add value. They don't provide a service. They're not making houses more accessible. In fact, by making them more expensive, they're kind of doing the opposite. And the only service that they can be accused of doing is maintaining houses. But let's face it, you're not paying them to do house maintenance. If you were paying them $15,000 to fix a sink late and poorly. If that was their real job, what you were paying them for, they'd be horrible at it and terribly expensive. Why you're paying them is not to fix your sink. You're paying them to live in the house. All landlords really do, when it comes down to it, is make housing. All landlords really do, when it comes down to it, is making housing more expensive, forcing you to hand over your labor in the form of money that you had to work for the privilege of not dying of hypothermia on the street. Not even to mention all the side effects of people seeking profit in the housing market. People buying properties just to rent them out, not to people looking for a home, but to tourists through services like Airbnb, because it makes them more money. And yes, it does make them more money, but it devastates neighborhoods that this happens in. And people looking for a home often can't find one because they're all way too expensive, and the ones that were available are all rented off to tourists. It might be an important thing to mention, I don't think all landlords are evil. I don't think all landlords are cartoonish evil billionaires with a big sack of money and a top hat and monocle. I recognize that most of them are just seeking to make a living, but just like with police, it's not very productive to look at the individual. It doesn't really matter whether the individual is a good person who can sleep well at night. What matters is their class interests. Even if a landlord is personally really good, treats their tenants well, doesn't charge them an exuberant rent, fixes the problems that the houses have on time, bakes them cookies, their class interests are still fundamentally aligned with the owning class. A landlord's interests are fundamentally misaligned with that of the working class. It is in a landlord's best interest to uphold the status quo in relation to private property ownership and seeing real estate as means to make money instead of a fundamental and necessary part of human life that should be a right. This doesn't change whether a landlord owns 1 or 1,000 properties. One argument that's typically used when defending the position that landlords deserve the money is that they take on risk and should be rewarded for that. I disagree with that, and the first reason is because everyone takes on that risk. The risk for owning a house isn't unique to landlords. It is also shared by everyone who buys a home. The risk of buying when the market is high and selling when it's low isn't unique to landlords. If normal homeowners don't get rewarded for that risk by society, then why do landlords deserve money to take on that risk? And the second, and probably more important reason, is because they didn't have to take on that risk. No one asked them to take on that risk. You see, taking on a risk on a home because you need a place to live, that's a necessary risk. taking on a risk because you want to make money isn't a necessary risk. A risk can be valuable to society, don't get me wrong. If you are an inventor and you take on a loan to bring a product to market that might make the world a better place, that's a risk that's valuable for society. Now, I don't mind people getting rewarded for taking on those risks, but I didn't ask you to buy a property for the sole reason of making money. You did that because you wanted to make money. You don't deserve money because you already had a lot and were capable of wanting to make more. In conclusion, landlords are parasites to society. They don't do anything for us and just make living more expensive. I am of the radical belief that the rights for someone to live in a house is more important than someone's privilege to make money. As such, I do think it's a good idea to collectivize housing and to seize the means of production, so to say, of the landlords. And if anyone is wondering, like, oh, what would happen to the poor landlords? Don't they have bills to pay? I have a very good solution. Get a real job, one that actually aids our society, one that actually adds value to people's lives. I don't know, go to McDonald's.